started. And
Oh,
we're
there you
officially
go.
recording. Okay, and we've started the meeting 10:05. Called to order. We have directors Estrada, Vice President Estrada, Director Aguilar, Jim Barrett, General Manager, Jeff Keel, Director of Finance, Carrie Swain, Controller, Jason Smith, Darren Hodge, and Ellen Clark, all as panelists this morning. And let me get started. Let's see, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. I think the first item on the agenda. Sorry, this is why I say it's hard for me to have something open because I have multiple things open and running through it. Okay. Minutes. I don't know if we had any other minutes. I don't believe we had minutes on there. So I'll move to comments from the audience. If there's any member of the public that would like to provide any comment at this time, please use the raise your hand feature and I will move you over to comments. I'll give everybody a minute. I don't see anyone other than staff online. So I will note that we had no members of the public for comments, and then we'll move into item 4A, which is grants and loans overview presentation by Darren Hodge.
So this is Jeff. I'm just going to start with a
Okay.
couple of overview comments real quick. First
Sure.
of all, we kind of reordered the agenda a little differently than we have in the past. We're doing the investment results last. In case you didn't get the word, we're not going to be talking about the investment policy today. So that was the last item on the agenda. We're going to defer that to the next meeting. We're going to do a quick grants and loans overview first, and then talk about the ERP next. So for this first one on grants and loans, there's actually three of us that are going to be talking about it. I'm just going to give you an overview comment. So if we'd look at the second presentation first, and am I sharing or are you sharing, Sylvia?
No, I think she's kind of said the panelists have to share.
Yeah,
Correct.
okay. So
down on the bottom, there should be
Down
a
at the
little
bottom,
green.
yep, there's a little green arrow that says share screen.
okay, I'm sorry. It's been a while since I've had to do this.
Well, maybe we should get you to do this more often.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
There you go.
can you see it?
Yeah,
Okay,
except it says grants and loans.
yeah, that's what we're going to start with this one first. So there's
Oh.
two PowerPoints on this item. So I just wanted to say that, so this information here on slide 2, this is the same kind of information that appears in the general manager's reports. But I just wanted to bring this to the finance committee's attention so you're aware of the rather significant effort that is going on with this over even just the last year. The district's effort for seeking grants, which is obviously free money and low-cost loans, has significantly stepped up as we're trying to accelerate the funding to get away from just being reliant on PAYGO and reserves, and we're needing to do more and more of these. This is a huge amount of money we're applying for. These efforts take a significant amount of time. They can take months or years to get approved, and then they have significant follow-up responsibilities afterwards. Carrie Swain has been managing this effort for finance for some time. And thank you, Carrie, for being in on your day off for this meeting. And then Darren Hodge, in a minute here, is going to talk to you about our additional efforts that are going on, looking at different alternatives to the traditional grants and loans that we're doing. So I'm not sure if you had any questions regarding any of these. And Carrie, did you want to be saying anything extra about these? I mean, there's nothing really new here.
No, and that page is in the, we typically include that in the general manager's
Right.
report, so.
So it's just more as there's a frame of reference. This is what we've been doing. This is what we continue to do.
Mhm.
And we have people from virtually every department involved in applying for these funds. And we hire a number of consultants to help us with a huge human effort that goes into obtaining and managing these grants and loans.
Jeff,
Hey, Jeff, oh, sorry, go ahead, Castillo.
Jeff, I think that for the grants, I don't know if there's matching funds for the grants or if they're completely, just free money. So maybe in the future, if we get to see this again, if there's any sort of match, maybe show that somewhere, unless you could just answer now that there's no match.
Okay, I'll let Carrie answer that.
Yeah, there's actually some of them that have a match, so I will make sure to put that on our next, because again, this page shows up on your monthly GM report, so I'll make sure to update that for the next month and include that column to show the match for some of these.
Okay, and then it'd be good, and this is just, just kind of brainstorming here. If we could also, well, let's just stick to that. Let's just
Okay.
the match.
And as we get ready to transition over to Darren, I'll just mention that, so these funds that are here, these are the ones that we've got. Darren Hodge is from PFM, our financial advisors, and Doug Brown, our bond attorney. We have a team that's working on funding alternatives for stormwater, domestic sanitation. Of course, we just recently did the Oasis bond. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren.
Hey,
And
Jeff, I have a
sorry.
couple of questions, sorry.
yes, sir. I'm sorry.
So one is more just of a procedural question. So how do we identify our resources when we go after these grants? Do we identify a project first and then go after the money, or do we do a money search and then try to fit the project to the money search? And also attached to that, what does staff do with respect to these applications and follow-up versus what the consultant does?
Great questions. Carrie, do you want to handle that?
Yes, so majority of the time we have a project first, and then because we base it on the capital improvement plan that engineering puts out. And so from there, we actively source out and find monies for those programs. And so the process as opposed to the consultant and with us, what the consultant helps us do is mostly more for the technical side of it, putting it together, but there's still a lot of effort on our part to provide them the information, provide them the financial data for the finance. And of course, for engineering, we have to do the environmental piece of it and also the detailed project cost for the program. So the role of the consultant is to help us kind of organize it and be the communicator. They have more relationship with a lot of these agencies. So that they help us along in that part to move these applications along.
Do they also bring us new grant and loan opportunities?
Yes, they do. So on about a quarterly basis, we get like a list of new programs that are coming, new opportunities. And so they keep up with us. They keep up with us on that. And also we are, all of us, majority of us here at the district, including Jim, forwards us any new programs that we get sent emails. We're all signed up to have automatic notice from all these agencies if there's new programs that are coming up, or even if it's an existing program, to remind us if there's an upcoming deadline that we can take opportunities on.
Okay,
So,
great.
yes.
That's very,
Mhm.
thanks, Carrie. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, I'll hand it over to Darren Hodge, and he's got his separate PowerPoint, which got loaded first in the system in the CIRE.
All right,
system.
thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
All right, and can everyone see my screen?
yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
All right. I like Jim giving the thumbs up. There we go. All right. So as Jeff mentioned, today I'm going to be walking through some of the borrowing alternatives. You know, whenever we are looking at a new capital project, we always look along with Jeff and his team, what's the most cost-effective way to fund that program? And today we're going to be talking about borrowing. And I want to preface this with borrowing's not always the preferred alternative. Obviously, PAYGO is the cheapest way to go, and so we look at that. But at times, given the size of capital projects and the timing of them, similar to what we did with East Rack last year, as well as the 2 stormwater projects with the WIFIA loan, from time to time we need to borrow. When we look at borrowing alternatives, typically there's about 3 different ways that you can borrow and 3 different areas that you can borrow from. The first is the public capital markets, and we'll talk about what that is in just a second. The second is the private capital markets. The third is state and federal loans. Now, each of these funding alternatives, as we'll talk more about, provides and presents its own set of benefits and considerations. These loan programs have differing interest rates, they have different terms and conditions, and all of those are very important to analyze because anytime we borrow, it's important to remember that this is an obligation that we have for potentially up to 30 years or longer. And so the terms and covenants that we're entering into, they need to make sense, not just today, but also for the life of the loan. And we need to understand and be aware of how these terms and covenants potentially affect some of the operational and financial decisions that we'll need to make going forward. And so on this slide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the general benefits and considerations of these 3 areas of borrowing. Now, it's important to remember when we talk about individual ways to borrow in these different categories, there will be specific nuances of each, but in general, these are just kind of broad considerations. So in the public market, an example of that would be bonds and notes. So the East Rack bonds that we sold last year, that's the public market. And the benefits of the public market is really the borrowing terms are often more standardized, and typically they're more driven by what works for us. And so we have our master resolution that Bond Council put together for us several years ago, and it lays out the terms and covenants of borrowings that we enter into. And the consideration that we have when setting those terms and covenants is what sort of ratings will we get with these terms and covenants. But we have the more ability to really structure those around what works for us financially and operationally. The second benefit of the public market is a greater predictability of receipt of funds. Most of the time when we are going to the public markets, we can get these funds within 3 to 6 months. And we'll contrast that with some of these other programs in a little bit. And the last is really, time efficient. 3 to 6 months is typically doable. And often that fits within the larger timing considerations that we have in terms of wanting to bid projects or really needing money for construction. So the considerations with the public market, the first one is issuance expenses. When we go sell bonds in the public market, we need to get ratings. We need to prepare disclosure. We have to pay lawyers. You have to pay me. You have to pay an underwriter. And so those are issuance expenses that are incurred. Often those are financed with bond proceeds, but nonetheless, they are issuance expenses that are incurred. The second is disclosure requirements. So anytime we sell public bonds, there's a disclosure document called the preliminary official statement and ultimately the official statement, which is really the marketing document and lays out the terms and conditions for investors to understand what they would be buying if they buy these bonds. Those obligations for disclosure continue throughout the life of the obligation. And so for as long as those bonds are outstanding, we have certain continuing disclosure requirements that we have to abide by. So that represents administrative cost and administrative considerations. So the second category is private placement. An example of a private placement would be where we go out and secure a loan directly with a bank, or we place an obligation with a single investor. It's not a public offering. It's more of a one-on-one negotiation with a particular lender. The benefit of a private placement is lower issuance costs because it's a private placement, typically you don't need ratings, typically you don't need disclosure. And so those are costs that aren't passed on to the district and ultimately to ratepayers. Also, these are typically pretty time efficient. Normally a private placement you can get done between 2 to 4 months. So they're a little bit quicker than the public market. So what are the considerations of that? Well, the term of the loans can often be constrained, whereas in the public market or some of the federal and state loans, we can go out 30, 35 years. Many banks that are providing money, often they want to stay inside of 12 to 15 years. There are some banks that go out a little bit longer, but the universe of banks willing to do that really dwindles pretty dramatically after that 12 to 15 year time period. In addition, market demand can be very unpredictable. Often that market is very opaque in terms of pricing. And so it's very difficult to gauge what type of interest we would get and what type of interest rate we would ultimately garner from the banks. So the third category here to talk about is federal and state loans. The main benefit with many of these programs is typically they have very low interest rates. Yeah, I mean, we saw that when we borrowed under the stormwater system, that WIFIA loan was sub 2%, whereas if we went and borrowed in the capital markets, it would have been much higher, probably in that 2.5% to 3% range. In addition, some of these programs can provide a little bit more flexibility during construction in terms of how they're funded and what we pay on funding costs during construction. So there are some advantages there. The main consideration with most federal and state loan programs is just the time between when we apply for the loan and when we get the money. Often these time periods can be more than 12 months, and with most programs, they can be 18 plus months. So it requires a lot of preparation in advance of that. Secondly, they're competitive. There's no guarantee that we get all of these loans. And so we have to have kind of a plan B if we go after the federal and state loans. The third, and this is one that we're going to hit on quite a bit, is that the terms and covenants may be more restrictive. In the public markets, we can mold those terms and covenants more around what works for us. But often these federal and state loan programs have their own sets of provisions that they require, and often they're more onerous than what we could achieve in the capital markets. In addition, some loan programs like USDA loans, they require interim financing during construction. And so that's another obligation that we have to go out and secure. It's additional financing that we have to pay during construction. And for an agency like the district, that's not often something that we would need to do otherwise. And so it may not be as beneficial for us. And some examples of federal and state loan programs, those are WIFIA, SRF, USDA loans, and State of California Infrastructure Bank loans. And I'll just pause there and see any questions before I move on. I know I went through a lot right there.
No.
Okay, perfect. So on this slide, what I want to walk through is some of the differences and some of the key terms and provisions that we look at when we're analyzing what's the best way to borrow when and if we have to borrow. And so the first one, and these aren't in order of priority, it's just how I've listed them here. The first thing that we're going to compare is the interest rate. So that's going to be the borrowing rate at which we're having to pay the lender for this loan or this borrowing. The second is transaction time. So how long does it typically take from the time that we kick off the transaction or we apply for it till when we get our money? The third is execution certainty. How certain is it that we will actually be approved or get our money? The fourth is our rate covenant. What the rate covenant is this is a covenant that you make with the lender or the investor that you will set rates at some level as a percentage of the debt service obligation. So an example of this would be if I have $1 of debt service and my rate covenant is 125%, then I would need to have net revenues of $1.25 at minimum. The additional bonds test, this is essentially a covenant that limits our ability to issue additional bonds, debt, or loan in the future, really to provide security for our existing lenders and investors. The next one is the optional redemption. The optional redemption is essentially our ability to redeem or refund any of these loans or obligations in advance of their maturity. A debt service reserve fund, that's additional security that may or may not be required for an investor. And essentially that's money set aside typically an amount equal to our maximum annual debt service. And it really provides security if for whatever reason we were unable to meet our debt service requirement from net revenues, we would draw on this reserve to make those payments. I will preface that with that is a a fund of last resort. Drawing on the debt service reserve fund is not viewed positively by investors or the rating agencies. So it's kind of that worst case scenario. And then we'll talk about other features. So let's just look at the interest rates. So in the public market, we ran this out as of early September, assuming AA category ratings. And assuming those parameters, we would be borrowing in today's market at about 2.5% to 3%. Now, when you compare that to a state or federal loan, we looked at what the SRF loan rate was during that same time period, and the SRF loan is a 1.1%. So you can see it's a very low cost of financing in comparison. The challenge with the private placement market, the reason that I don't have a rate here is, again, what I was talking to, it's a very volatile and opaque market. And so it's hard to gauge exactly what that would be. But typically, it's around the public market rate in most cases, but no guarantee. So the next thing is transaction timing. So as we talked about before, in the public market, typically between, I've got 3 to 5 here, but 3 to 6 to be conservative in terms of how long the transaction will take. In the private market, between 2 to 3 months. And then again, we were talking about state and federal loans. It can vary, but often it can be 18 plus months from the time that we apply to when we actually get our money. And so in terms of how long it is until we get those funds, the state and federal loan programs often require a much larger lead time at the outset, which requires some consideration from our perspective in terms of how will we make those project cost payments and construction fund payments during that time where we may or may not get that loan. And that gets us to execution certainty. In the public markets, relatively high execution certainty. We can tell you with pretty strong probability that whether or not we'll be able to execute a deal in the public market. Private placement, I have that at medium just because it's no guarantee if the bank market's there. It really depends on what's going on in the economy, bank regulations, et cetera. And then I also put state and federal loans at medium only because they are competitive programs. And depending on the nature of our project, it may not score as high as other projects. And there's often limited funding for these various programs. So then let's talk about rate covenant. Most of our funds have a rate covenant of 125% of net revenues. I say most because stormwater is kind of a little bit of a unique fund because it doesn't pay debt service out of net revenues. It pays debt service out of gross revenues. But in general, 125% of net revenues is our rate covenant. That would likely be the same rate covenant we'd have for a private placement. For state and federal loans, that's where it differs because, again, the WIFIA program, the SRF program, they will have their own provisions that they require. And as an example, not to specifically point to SRF, but that's an example that's relevant, is that the SRF program, their most recent loans require 125% rate covenant, but it's on maximum annual debt service for the next 5 fiscal years. That's important because if we have ascending debt service or we have structured our deal with no debt service for 3 or 4 years, like we did with East RAC, if we enter into an SRF loan, we still have to set rates based off the highest debt service payment during that time, which may be 5 years out. But so that's kind of the consideration with that, is that we have to be very aware of what these covenants may force us to do if we enter into them. The additional bonds test, again, these are pretty standard for our documents, 125% of net revenues. And again, very similar feature for the state and federal loan programs, that 125% of maximum annual debt service. So depending on what the shape of our debt service is and what our coverage looks like, that could be a consideration. Optional redemption features, very standard in the public market, is a 10-year par call. Private placements, you often can customize these a little bit more with the lender. Some lenders will allow you to redeem them earlier. Sometimes it's as early as 2 years. Sometimes it's 5 years. It really just depends on what their internal credit committee decides is appropriate or what they want to bid. With the state and federal loan programs, again, it varies. Our WIFIA loan it's quite flexible in this regard. They allow us to redeem it at any time. The SRF loan program, more recent provisions, we can redeem it, but it's based on requiring the consent and approval of the director of the State Water Resources Control Board. The reason they do that is because they go out and they issue debt, which is secured by the SRF loans that we enter into. And so they have considerations on their end on how to manage their loan portfolio. But it's a consideration for us because let's just say 10 years from now, we need to restructure these loans because of some legal provision or something just doesn't work for us anymore. If the state did not provide us that consent, we could not redeem that loan and make those changes that we needed to make. So it's a very important consideration to understand and be aware of. The debt service reserve fund, again, this is really credit by credit dependent. In the public market, typically if we're in the AA category, which a lot of our funds are, we would need a reserve. Private placement, often we can get away with a reserve without one there as well. State and federal loan programs, case by case basis. It really depends. For instance, on the WIFIA loan, we are having to set aside some funds in reserve fund for that, but it really just depends on precedent, the individual borrowing that's being made, and kind of terms and provisions on the state or federal agency's part. Other features, the one that I wanted to point out here is really related to USDA, and not to pick on them or call them out, but it is an important nuance, is that with all of these federal and state loan programs, for the most part, financing is provided on a reimbursement basis. So we have to expend the cost and then submit for reimbursement. That does add some element of risk or consideration and very careful tracking on how project costs and projects are bid, the types of project costs that are eligible, et cetera. In addition, USDA loans, they require that you secure interim financing. So effectively, we have to come up with our own financing for all of the construction costs during construction. The USDA loan is only then available to be drawn on after project construction completion. And at that point, the USDA loan essentially refunds the interim financing that we entered into. So it introduces another element of cost and another element of potential risk, because in many cases, if our project is delayed for whatever reason, that could introduce some potential complications with the timing of receipt of the funds under certain programs. I'm not saying that they wouldn't be willing to negotiate, but under the terms of the document, they often have provisions that require construction being completed by a certain date. And so that's really the end of the presentation. But what I want to end with is that whenever we go out and borrow, these are the types of considerations we look at, because, and it's really borrowing by borrowing and fund by fund specific, because it's tough to ignore an SRF loan rate of 1.1%. I mean, that is a very attractive cost of financing, and your interest costs are very low. But we have to make sure that that works for us, because over the next 5 years, if we are trying to restructure our rates or looking very carefully at our debt service coverage, they have provisions within the SRF loans that may not work for us. And so that's why, even though sometimes the loan rate may be attractive, it may not be the best overall value for the district, because it may not work for us from a practical standpoint. And so that's the one thing that I want to leave everyone with, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. It really is case-by-case dependent, and we spend a lot of time looking through what's the best fit for the district at that point in time for that project.
So Darren, in a prior life, we used commercial paper, bridge loans, private placement, and then we do a refi through the sale of bonds or the public offering. I'm not as familiar. Is it possible to do commercial paper and then bundle a bunch of projects together for a state and federal loan, or are they still a case-by-case financing, which seems to be the way we're approaching it now? We don't have enough of a project portfolio, say, that would require us to bundle them and then go get public bonds. But I've done that with commercial paper. In the bond market, I just haven't done it with state loans, and I was wondering whether that's possible.
Yeah, Jim, you're absolutely right. In many cases, you can. So, and we did that with the WIFIA loan. We had the 2 stormwater projects that we are financing some of the project costs with our revolving line of credit, basically the same thing as commercial paper, but then we're using the WIFIA loan to take out those draws next year. And similarly, we could do that with some of the other projects like SRF loans, if we've got a project and we want to make some of the project cost payments before the SRF loans available, we can make that happen as well. So you're absolutely right. And it's a good idea in many cases to do that, because when we are entering into long-term debt, particularly in the public markets, we do have tax law requirements that whenever we issue debt, that we make a representation. When I say we, the district makes a representation that 85% of the proceeds can be spent within 3 years. And for some large, longer term projects, that may not be feasible. And so to your point, that's where commercial paper is helpful, because then you can bundle these costs together and sell bonds once and only pay issuance expenses once, versus having to do it twice, for instance, and pay everyone twice, which doesn't always make sense.
Thank you.
Darren, I have a question, or maybe Jeff knows this. What was the interest rate on the recent placement that we did, the financing, the private placement? What was the rate?
Oh, you mean on the East Rack bond?
Yeah,
The Oasis.
Let me pull that up. I don't have it in front of me, Director, but that's an excellent question. Let me see if I can find that real quick.
yeah,
for
that
you.
would be
I
good.
apologize.
No worries. I'm just curious because also in the section, you just took it down, but in the section where we talk about the debt reserve requirements, not necessarily being required, I seem to recall we had quite a bit of discussion at the board meetings on that financing about our reserve requirements. And I don't know if that was more of a generic discussion, Jeff, or did we wind up having to do a reserve fund on the Oasis bond?
Darren, we do have reserve requirements relating to Oasis, don't we?
Sorry. So with regards to the reserves, there's a couple different, when we're talking the debt service reserve fund, this is a restricted fund that investors may require. It wasn't required with Oasis because of the level of our ratings. With regards to the reserve policy, I think maybe what you're referring to, Director, is some of the unrestricted or designated reserves that the district maintains for capital expenditures or repair and rehab, those sorts of things that are related but a little bit different.
Are those what the rating agencies look at?
No, so that's an excellent question. So the rating agencies will actually look at both. So what they will look at in terms of our unrestricted or our designated funds is they look at that from a day's cash perspective. They want to know how much rainy day funds we have set aside for the what if scenarios. The debt service reserve fund, the reason that they look at that is for lower rated credits, it provides an additional level of security for bondholders if for some reason a debt service payment wasn't made, that you'd have funds available to make a payment temporarily until a fix could be provided. Often with credits in the AA category and higher, because you're already so highly rated, that risk is so small anyways, that they've evolved in their thinking to say a reserve fund in those cases doesn't really add a whole lot of benefit.
I see. Okay.
And I have found the number you were looking for, John. Initially, we projected a 3.3% interest rate on the Oasis. And I think what I have, the all-in fully sold was 2.73.
Oh, great. Okay, good.
I wanted to follow up on Director Aguilar's question regarding the Oasis project. And I wanted to understand the kind of the driver for the rate increase that we did for East Rack. I think the way it was presented, Jeff, it was that somehow we needed to have that rate increase in order to try to secure this bond or the finance mechanism. And so I'm just wondering, as it relates to everything that was explained about the kind of the day cash or whatever. So what was the driver behind that?
Well, I'll actually say, so the rate increase for the East Replenishment Fund had to do with everything in that fund except this project. So the debt financing costs are being paid for by additional property taxes, which we're putting in that fund each year. And we're dedicating that throughout the term of the Oasis bond.
I recall now. Yeah, when you mean the canal, we were, so the debt related to Oasis is not, it was coming from canal pretty much, or from the transfer from the property
That's,
tax. So,
that's correct.
okay,
Now, there's costs associated with the Oasis project. Obviously, there's ongoing O&M, and that is part of the driver for rate increases. But we,
yeah, because the CIP, I mean, it was almost nothing, right?
it had been proposed to be higher. The board just on a Tuesday approved the
Madison.
project. Yeah, thank you. So that was, I believe, the only remnant of the CIP program left.
Okay, thank you for
other
that
than
clarification.
Right.
Yeah, makes sense now. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
No,
Well, thank you, Darren. Darren is also on vacation today, so we are very thankful of him taking the time to give his presentation. And we're glad to give you the opportunity to get a little preview of what's ahead. We are working on these alternatives for financing for, as I said, for domestic stormwater and sanitation. We're looking at, bridging the gap of that funding shortfall relating to the sanitation, or I'm sorry, the stormwater projects, which, the cost came out significantly higher. We've got a calendar we're refining for domestic water projects now to deal with the interim financing needs. And we're hoping to bring that to the board fairly soon. So when you start seeing those documents popping in, potentially as early as October, you'll have some of the more of the background on what got us there. Is there any other questions for any of us?
no, not for me.
Okay,
I'm good.
great. Thank you. Thank you, Darren. We'll let you get on to your vacation.
Yeah, thank y'all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Okay, Vice President Estrada, we ready to move on to the ERP item?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Carrie Swain is going to be presenting this item. You have a PowerPoint in your packet that she's going to go through. And based upon Director Aguilar's questions that came in yesterday, she's added some additional narrative to her presentation. So I'll hand it over to Carrie.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me see, Sylvia, I'll just share my screen, right?
So go down to the bottom.
Okay. Can you, all right, there you go. Can you see my
go.
screen? Okay.
Mhm.
Let's hope I'm showing it properly. Good morning. So just to start off, last June, last year, SDI Presence LLC completed and provided us a final report, which was presented to the board back then for the strategic assessment and gap analysis of the district's utility billing, financial system, human resources, and payroll system. Based on that report, they found over 46 functional gaps across all the modules, including significant reporting and system integration deficiencies. So the final recommendation on that study was to procure and replace the existing ERP and UB system. So the development of the RFP for the ERP and the UB system was selected as a strategic planning initiative back in fiscal 2021, but with the pandemic, we had kind of postponed that, and it has actually received the second highest vote, as this is a critical system that is needed to be replaced. So I will be presenting the purpose of bringing this to the committee and a brief history on the evolution of the district's ERP and UB system. an estimated cost projection, and a final recommendation. So the district put together a committee, which included the assistant general managers and the department directors across the entire district to plan and to discuss the replacement of the ERP and the UB system. Replacing these two systems is daunting and a huge undertaking, as it is one of the core operating systems for the district. However, the committee understands that the need for the replacement is imminent. It is critical to eliminate the functional gaps, improve data security, and prevent the possibility of compromising data integrity resulting from the use of multiple customized systems. So the purpose of this presentation is to seek board support into hiring SDI presence, who did our strategic assessment to begin the procurement service phase of a new ERP and UB system. Personally, I have been involved in 3 major financial system implementations, one in a private sector with a big corporation which involved multiple countries, and 2 in a public agency, with one of them with another water district. In each of the implementation, there's always a lesson to be learned. In all those experiences, the one key factor that helped make it less daunting is proper planning. No implementation, I can't guarantee, no implementation will go perfectly smooth. But the hope is that with proper planning, it can help minimize the challenges that may come along. The procurement service phase of the new ERP and UB system is the first step in the planning stage. As each entity is unique, it is critical to create a solid scope of work and requirements that will work for the district. It is also important to hire a consultant with no ties to any potential vendors so that we can ensure an objective process. So overall, the impact for this planning stage is estimated at $131,000 for the next 2 fiscal years. And I'll kind of go over the timing towards the end of the presentation. But we did take into consideration to make sure that the timing of it does not interfere with our competing projects. This is going to be after SCADA and NextGen is fully implemented. So this slide here kind of shows you a brief overview of the district's ERP and UB system. From when I was preparing this, when I was researching this, from what I've gathered, Naviline has been around since 1980s or 1990s. And I have no reason to believe it was not, since I was still using green screens when I began working here at the end of 2018. We couldn't even expand the screen bigger than a 5x7. So over the last 12 years since its implementation in 2009, the existing ERP and UB system has gone through multiple acquisitions as shown in this slide. And the Naviline system was no longer updated as of 2010, which is almost a year after we implemented it. There has been no planned development for the system. So we had to have done multiple patchwork in-house to keep the system running, including hiring various consultants and acquiring third-party systems just to supplement the functions not provided by our current ERP. And that is where the compromise of data integrity comes in at times, because now we have multiple systems that's providing us data. So what is an ERP plan, resource planning? As you can see on this slide, it really is the centralized system for all users. That is the intent of an ERP. It includes the financial piece of it. That's where we do all our budgeting, our CIP, determination, the procurement process, our cash maintenance, our grant and debt, and all the reporting. Financial reporting is the biggest piece for the ERP. But it also is needed to talk to all the other subsystems. You know, NextGen is the new work order system that we're currently implementing, but it needs to talk to ERP because we need to be able to transfer data back and forth between the systems and all the other systems. We also have the utility billing, and we also have Masterworks, which handles our capital improvement tracking system. So it's important for us to have a good ERP system to be able to handle all the functions that's needed for the district, including especially our human resources and our payroll. So this slide right here, and please stop me if I'm talking too fast, I apologize. I'm trying to be conscious of time. So this slide right here is it's kind of like the results of this, a summary of the strategic assessment and gap analysis that was done to get us to where we're at. So I'm going to take a little more time on this slide because I kind of wanted to kind of go through all of the pieces on here. So the existing ERP and UB system has served the district's needs in the past. But as new technologies emerge, new regulations are implemented, and even customer needs to access information, including the urgency, has become more prevalent. So the inability of our existing system to meet those needs continue to become a harder challenge to overcome in the last couple of years. As I mentioned, we hired SDI to do this complete assessment. So I'll kind of go through the cost consideration. I'll kind of talk about that towards the end. So the next one is the improved billing and accuracy of the revenue, just to kind of give you guys an impact on this. So I do want to thank Director Scott Burrett for helping me provide the analysis on this section. So AWWA estimate that water utilities lose about 3 to 15% of revenues due to under registering meters. And other focus groups also find that revenue losses can range above 10% when there are complex billing structures resulting from underbilling. The district's budget-based tiered rate structure is complex, creating potentially unique water budgets for every property. So our existing customer billing system has inadequate analytical tools built in to quickly find failing meters or anomalies within the data that can result in inaccurate bills. If we use the calculation that was provided by AWWA, which is a potential loss of 10% in revenue, if we use that, we can lose up to 8.2 million annually on a domestic water fund. So without the analytical tools that available to us right now, we can't really measure the potential loss, or they're just based on what AWWA provided for us. And I'll give more information on that when we go through the cost as well. Customer communications. So just to demonstrate how outdated our ERP system is, the only customer communication method it supports is US mail. So we had to go out and contract with multiple third-party systems such as Paymantis and Everbridge to support customer communication via telephone, email, and text. The next one is a reliance on third-party systems. Many can be eliminated, thus saving us money that could increase our return on our investments for this new ERP and utility billing system in the future. For example, just on our accounts payable, we process over 2,000 invoices a month. We don't have the approval workflow in the UB system, and the ERP system. So we have to go and use a third-party system to get through that process. But sometimes the security of that, is challenging as well. The next one is a self-service portal. So we don't have the ability to allow customers to submit applications for service and informational updates such as change addresses. The customers have been asking for greater access to their consumption data and their work order status updates. None of those are being provided by our current systems now. And recently, in the last 5 years, I could say, Naviline support has been declining because, again, they're no longer enhancing it. So we're having to do a lot of patchwork internally to make this happen, or also pay them extra fees to try to get them to process new guidelines or process new changes that we have to implement. So the risk of failure increases over time. System capabilities and limitations. So as new policies, I mentioned again, so it's the same thing, it's the system limitation capabilities. New policies and regulations are implemented, so there's a need to update the system. Recently, we had this issue when the Senate Bill 998 related to domestic water turnoff was implemented. We had to turn off the automated system because we had to revert to a manual process because the system was not able to comply with SB 998. So a year later, up to now, customer billing continues to attempt a workaround with Central Square with no end in sight. This limitation could limit us in the future if we have a rate restructuring. So another example is that current interface with our new NextGen work order, which is a great system for us to help us manage our assets. We had to pay an additional $200,000 to Naviline that could have been prevented just so that they can talk to the system to allow for the API. And we're still testing that integration part of it now. So that kind of jumps in, with the same with the system interface. So just to kind of give you another example on this, on the challenges that we have, We have about 26,731 canal work orders that were placed over the phone last year. We had 15,000 applications for domestic water service and address information update. And our current system cannot handle that automatically. So now, our customer service representatives have to manually address those requests. And then having to figure out whether to put it in Naviline, the other third-party systems such as Everbridge, Premantis, or FileNet. So customers' calls could have been handled more quickly with modern and customer service interface. And then the reporting challenges is another area that was found. With limited reporting capabilities, we have to use manual processes to just run basic reports or query data. And so even when we're trying to compile canal informations, that has to be done manually as well. So that's kind of like just all of the challenges that's been addressed in the report. I kind of wanted to kind of bring that back. Based on that information, it's and the continued challenges that we're encountering with Naviline, it has not become a question of if we need to change the system. It just has become a question of when should we be changing the system? And this is kind of like where I'm trying to work on the timeline. So this next slide is what we're trying to consider as we're going through this process. You know, key considerations that we need to address. Again, I emphasize the importance of planning. You know, we need to develop an ERP and UB requirement with an eye to the future. We need to, that's why hiring SDI is critical, because we need to make sure that we kind of have all the requirements dove in, because we're unique. We're a unique district. We have multiple services that we provide. So it's important for us to have a solid foundation for our ERP and our UB system, so that the RFP has to be written that captures all of that scope of work and that requirement. With the system, we can simplify it. We're going to be streamlining a lot of processes. We can collect information and enter it once. Right now, we're having to do a lot of double entries because we have to put it on a third-party system and then the ERP system just to kind of make it work. We can reduce manual and paper-based process. And on top of that, part of this plan is that we're going to be looking into our current business process and make sure that we maximize the use of our system features and functionality. So I'm trying to watch the time, so I'm going to kind of skip over. Pretty much this slide kind of shows a lot of our key considerations as well. So this next slide right here is just kind of like try to come up with an estimated cost of the ERP and the UB by contacting several agencies that recently implemented new systems. So this kind of shows, it ranges. Again, agencies have different requirements, they're unique, but this kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of how much they've spent in the last 2-3 years. So that's just a handy slide to kind of look into. I'll go on to the next slide for us. So this graph shows an estimated annual cost impact, estimated one. So I wanted you to kind of focus on the graph that says the annual cost. So this annual cost is the estimated annual cost. This is if we replace the ERP and the UB system. So using the comparisons from the previous page, we use $7 million as the new ERP and UB cost to be repaid in about 15 years at 2%. In addition, we added an anticipated maintenance and system integration cost that may remain even if we get a new system. We're going to have to pay maintenance costs and some system integration, because the plan is to keep NextGen and Masterworks. And that's going to be a requirement when we go out to look for a new system, that it has a smooth integration for that. So at that, you could see that the total cost for that is about $892,000 a year. And on the right side of the graph is the redirected cost. So this is the potential cost that we could be saving. So you can see the maintenance, we kind of kept it the same, because whether we go for an old one or we keep the new one, you're still going to pay that maintenance cost. Same thing with the system integration. I apologize, I don't know why the graph is not the same size, but it's really 0.1 estimate for system integration. And we also have about $400,000. So based on interviewing all the departments, all the district, what their manual process is, we've kind of calculated some of the functions that I'm aware of that is now automated in most newer ERP and UV systems. So we could be saving about close to $400,000 a year in manual process that can be addressed. So that can be applied towards the cost of the new system. And on top of that, the blue line, the blue graph up there, the bar up there, I actually went conservative, like I mentioned earlier. This is the anticipated cost of recouping that potential revenue loss that we're encountering because of the outdated utility billing system that we have. So just to give you an example, in the last fiscal year, the service department initiated a revenue assurance initiative that reprioritized the focus from identifying and conducting proactive outreach to customers with high consumption. So they just focused on high consumption that have failed meters, which are under recording consumption. And based on that, they found 1,306 failing meters. And they were identified and replaced, and approximately 200,000 in revenue was recaptured. And those meters were replaced in July and August. And July and August, some more were found, and then we added another 65,000 in potential loss. So without the tools of a newer system, we should be searching for more of these failing systems, but we don't have that ability right now with the current UB system that we have. So I kind of went conservative on the calculation. It's at 300,000. I kind of stuck to that based on the recent finding on a failed meter. But again, based on AWWA's average of agencies across, it's about 10%. So 10% for us is a lot, like I mentioned earlier. So again, I just kind of want to refocus, and the plan is to introduce us to start the process. And as you can see here, this is the procurement phase of this process, and we need to get this started. So we cannot determine the final cost of how much it's totally going to cost us without actually issuing an RFP. And again, it's critical for us to issue it properly, have the proper scope of work, have a solid foundation, vetting all the process that we have. If we need to change a business process to follow best practices, we're going to be addressing that as well in this RFP. So this is the plan is to start it in this fiscal year, which is going to be costing us about $56,000 to initiate it, to assess it. And then next fiscal year, another additional $75,000 to publish it, to select it, and then to negotiate. Again, the board would have an opportunity to look at this proposals and see how we're going to go from there. So why did we hire? So this is a quick snapshot of why we're recommending SDI. The first and foremost, SDI already completed our strategic assessment, our gap analysis. So they're very familiar with the district already. They interviewed over 60 staff members of the district when they completed the study. So having them continue this process, it would diminish some of our hours. That's why the RFP process was only 131, because they cut a lot of hours. It was already captured on the first study. So, they have experience, they have a comprehensive knowledge of the UB and ERP solution providers. They can eliminate a lot of our processes for us. So I don't want to read through this because I'm conscious of time. It's 11 o'clock. So if you have any specific questions on this slide, I can go back, but I hope you were able to read that. So the next slide is just the timing. So if you can see the timing, I've kind of laid out a proposed timing of the planning stage. So if we do get approval to move forward with SDI to start the issuance of the RFP, we're hoping to start that by about February of next fiscal year. The first phase 1 and 2, which is project planning and the kickoff and the assessment, to initiate it, to assess it, hopefully by May and June, to prepare it, to publish it, to publish the RFP. This process actually averages about 6 to 9 months. 9 months, 6 months is being aggressive, but we want to take our time to make sure that we've captured everything. So I'm estimating about 9 months to get this whole process going. And then going through the next fiscal year from July to March is where we're going to do all the, we're going to go through interviews with the vendors, with the proposers, going through the whole process of researching it, vetting them. It's a whole process. So again, that's going to take us a while because we want to make sure that we're selecting the right system that will fit our needs. And the last slide is just, again, a proposed schedule implementation guideline. So if we do select a vendor by the end of fiscal year 2023, then the hope is to phase it in. So since it's a huge system, it's not going to be one implementation. We have to start it in phases. So the phase 1 is going to be the core financial system, and that's going to take about a year. And then we have to bring in the human resource and the payroll system. That's going to take another year. And then the third phase is going to be the utility billing. So we're very cognizant about making sure that SCADA and NextGen is completed before we go through this process. And so that's like the last slide for me. And I'm sorry if I went too fast. I'm trying to be cognizant of the time. So if you have any specific questions, and Director Aguilar, I know you had sent us questions. I hope that addressed your concern. And if not, I could expand a little bit more.
Thanks, Carrie. I know this is incredibly complex and something that's critical for the district. But just a couple of questions. So is the request for the proposals that SDI is going to be handling, is that only for procurement? So that you mentioned that, you know, there are 46 gaps in terms of areas in the organization that need to be addressed through these programs. Will they address just 2 of the 46 or?
Well,
No, I'm sorry, do you want to speak, Jeff?
yeah, could I jump on real quick? So
Sure.
our plan is to construct an RFP document which incorporates a query of all of these gaps that were identified through our lengthy process for gap analysis. And so we're going to be essentially asking for each of these items, does your system handle this? And if it does not, then what third-party vendors are there that would be compatible with your system that would handle it? So rather than just having staff, you know, go through and say, oh, well, they said yes, or they said no, we would be looking at SDI, their expertise in helping us evaluate that. If their yeses are really yeses and their nos are really nos, and to help us through the evaluation process to really test with fire the truth and accuracy of their assertions, rather than just relying upon what they put in paper and then, you know, resulting in, you know, litigation is one of your only options of dealing with it. So and it's also such a lengthy process from evaluation through implementation. It's a huge impact on staff, and I think it's important to recognize that we get that. You know, all of us have gone through these implementations. None of us are really anxious to do this because we know it's a huge effort, and it's not like you can just hire backfill help to cover normal duties while the people that are on the implementation team are doing this. The fact is, a lot of the times, the staff that's working on implementing this, really, they're doing double duty a lot. So everyone that's been considering this is cognizant of what's ahead, that it's going to be a huge impact. And that's why the general manager has been very sensitive about, okay, we already have these 2 major projects ongoing with SCADA and NextGen for the asset management. And we really need to get past those before we dive into another organization-wide effort. And so this effort, as far as the RFP, can run parallel to the end of those other processes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I would just say that when this next comes back to us, to the board, full board, that the explanation that you just gave about the intention is to try to cover as many, if all, of the areas of concern.
Yes,
I think that's really important because I think at least my initial take on reading the presentation was that it was not all inclusive. So I think that's really important, particularly if we're looking at a buy-in of $7 million, long term. So that's my opinion. I think you guys can run with it either way, but that I recognize, because I've been through this as well. It's incredibly complex. A lot of it depends upon the vendor and their ability to provide technical assistance. And, you hire somebody, then you lose the vendor, and then you have to get somebody else who can't train the staff, and it can be very complicated. So, you guys are already incredibly busy as it is with ongoing responsibilities. So, I think going forward, I wish you luck.
thank you.
So I kind of wanted to add a little bit, Director Aguilar. So this is just the first stage of the planning phase. And then if once we select it and we move forward with the replacement, we are going to be proposing to hire SDI to project manage, to help us project manage the implementation. Because again, it's very important for us to make sure that what we're getting, what the vendor selected is providing us is going to happen, I guess. So it's very important for us to have the outside consultant who has thorough experience, which is SDI, to implement this system. But that's something that we come back after the RFP is done, after we've selected a vendor, and the board decides to move forward in selecting a vendor. Then that's going to be part of it. It's going to propose to get SDI back to help us manage the system. So the key is finding one system that will provide both the ERP and the UB, so that, again, it will capture all these gaps. It will close all the gaps that were found.
Good.
And one final point I'd like to toss in about the cost of what's currently been going on. It's really partly to keep the existing system going, but also there have been third-party softwares that have been implemented, which will very likely continue with the new system. So whether you're looking at Masterworks and engineering, or you're looking with NeoGov for HR, it's not like we're wasting money in the implementation of those systems.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I have some questions, comments on. So Carrie, I think you answered one of them. I was going to ask what it seemed like. Well, when you went through the slide with the phases, I think it's slide 12. Is this still all part of the planning, or is this also include implementation? Because I wanted to get a sense of SDI's involvement, specifically as it related to like the vendors. And then I think I saw some stuff here, making sure like prepare proof of capabilities sessions. Is this all planning, or is?
This is the procurement process.
Yeah, this is the procurement process. So all of this stage right here is what's that 131,000 is.
Okay, and then you just mentioned that I think the game plan is that once you enter into implementation, that you would kind of bring them back to kind of do some project management.
Yes.
And seeing some of the slides previously where you've kind of also showed that there was project managers involved in some of those implementation projects. Did the 7 million that you include the cost of that project management component? Because they seem pretty high. They seem like $500,000 or $1 million.
Oh, so you're talking about the past, this one right here?
Yeah. So you see some of these like project management, like some project managers. So are we anticipating the same cost, and is that rolled into the project?
No, I mean they have given us some initial, but it's not as high as that. I can't really speak for what happened back in 2009, but because I think part of this is if you look at the 2006, they included just not the ERP, but they had the GIS system in there and the asset system. And now we already have the asset system with NextGen. And we
Okay,
have a separate GIS system. So it's going to be a little bit different. I can't really
okay.
determine until we get the proposals and how much involvement, depending on the system that we select.
But they're going to give you a proposal for their
Yes.
cost for project management.
That's correct. They're going to be giving us a proposal that would be introduced when we select the vendor.
Okay, and then the other thing is, I think the reason why you're bringing this to us and eventually you're going to bring it to the board is that once we pull the trigger on all this, we're almost all in on the project, right? So I think that's kind of the thinking, Jim, right? Is that if we're not going to pull the trigger on this if we're not ready to pull the trigger on the whole project, because then it doesn't make sense. And so that kind of leads me to the other question related to, is there any thought, and I imagine that there is, I'm sure there is, and especially I think as you mentioned, when we implemented, I think it was SunGuard or something, right after we implemented it, a year later, it seemed like they just didn't do anything. So are we gonna, is there a component in here that looks at or it tries to evaluate as we are looking for vendors, kind of their longevity or their, our projections as it relates to, continued support or because I don't think we want to make, we don't want to spend $7 million and then find ourselves, we're kind of back on the same, from the moment we implement it, from that point on, it's becoming obsolete.
Yes, and that's going to be considered. Again, I can't speak for the back in 2009, but from what I gathered, again, I wasn't here back then when they selected Naviline. They initially sent out that analysis, but I don't think they gathered any proposals. Naviline was just selected because of the experience of a prior director of finance had a lot of experience with Naviline, so it was just kind of like recommended, not really went out to write a huge scope of work, I guess, back then. So now we're doing a different way this time around. Is we're actually going to go ahead and issue the RFP to have a complete scope of work and requirement for us to make sure that we're capturing all the needs. And in addition, we are still going to be inviting, because again, Naviline have moved to Central Square, and Central Square is the new major company there. They're still going to be invited to propose as well. It's just that they have a new system, which is called One Solution. And it's not an option for us, but it's almost like a similar thing. We're doing a full implementation. It's going to cost us about the same. So we might as well give ourselves an opportunity to look at all the vendors out there rather than just recommending, let's just upgrade, use the same company and upgrade to One Solution. But we want to have the opportunity to look at all the options and make the best determination for us. And that's one of the key components, looking to the future, right? There's a lot of changes now where we have cloud-based versus server-based, and those are all considerations as well. So yes, we are planning for that longevity. We need to keep up with our updates when they have annual updates. That's important. That's why it's important as well to have an ERP that talks to all these third-party systems. Because one of the challenges of having separate systems is if one system upgrades, they don't care about the other systems, right? But if you have one major central critical center line, they're the one who's going to worry about managing the other systems to make sure that they're all upgrading and it all works, that it doesn't impact us. Because right now we have so many separate contracts that if one upgrades, the other one doesn't care. And we have to then pay extra money to help it integrate. So that's another key factor that we're considering, is when we go out to the RFP, we want to make sure that it's going to talk and have a very smooth transition with NextGen, Masterworks, and NeoGov, because those are 3 new systems that the district has procured to help us, right? So we want to make sure those has a smooth relationship.
Carrie, when we implement that, I don't know what you called it, kind of the center core, which is this, do they not offer like a package where they have like a similar branch off of what you just called Masterworks, NextGen, or the other ones that it's almost like if you buy this, then you can buy that. Because
Yes.
because I think what I heard from Jeff was that right now the plan is to keep those. And so I'm wondering, do you have to keep them? Is there an opportunity to phase them out to something that's similar that is part of that central core so that as one updates, they're all being updated?
Well,
Um,
there's certain ones that are of a nature that we would hope would be included, but there are other aspects that they just don't need to be so embedded in an ERP. For example, NeoGov is a great way of managing our recruitment process, our application process, et cetera. It, by nature, it doesn't need to be part of our core systems. And yet being able to have communications two ways may be for certain aspects important. But other things we would expect to be incorporated in the system. And as I experienced in prior implementations, what a marketing end of a company that's bidding on this is likely to do is saying, oh yeah, our system handles that, or we can make it work, or we can develop it. We don't want to be buying something where we think we've acquired a full package and then find out, well, it's really a kit that you've got to put together on your own, or you know, we have the experts that can help develop that for you. I mean, I went through that with Oracle and PeopleSoft promising the world, but it was all vaporware when it came down to their presentations on what their current system capabilities could do for our organization. So that's why we're going to go through a unique procurement process and have SDI help us with the evaluation all the way through.
Yeah, and I kind of want to add, Director Estrada, so a lot of the new companies now, even Central Square themselves, they do partner up with other entities to make sure that we're getting the best breed on all the systems. So even though they have the core, and they, you know, they're kind of buying out or making a partnership with other companies to make sure that they can provide us the best brand. So like for a utility billing system, it could be somebody a part of the core financials, but they might be partnering up to make sure with another entity to make sure that it will work. That it will provide what we need. Like we have the canal water, which is very unique. We've already found another system potentially that might have that capability. So it's going to be all part of that scope of work. That's why it's important for us to get a good consultant to make sure that everything is captured, that we can address all of those concerns. So just to kind of alleviate, again, I've been through this 3 times and it is very challenging. You know, I spent almost 80 hours a week for almost 2 years trying to implement a system. So I know it's very daunting. It's very challenging. It's a huge undertaking for us. So that's why we're not recommending this path lightly. We wouldn't recommend it if this is not the right way for the district to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have like 3 more presentations.
Well, we've got 2 more.
2 more,
And-
okay.
And really, I want to do a time check with the board members to be sensitive. If you have to be off a certain time, you know,
I'm good. I'm good until noon.
I'm good until noon as well. But
okay.
the sooner the better. If we
I
could,
know our general manager doesn't have till noon. So let's switch to our main investment portfolio review. I'll ask Jason Schmidt from Chandler to go through that. And then when he's done, we'll switch to having Ellen Clark from PFM go through our OPEB portfolio. And we'll keep it going as rapidly as possible.
All right. Good
Jason,
afternoon,
you're up.
everyone. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
And can you see the presentation?
yes.
Perfect. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly and just kind of hit the high points for everybody. And so I'm going to start off here, and we're going to talk about the economy. So the economy continues to rebound. We do expect that there will be very high growth, but that expectation has been coming down. I think the highest expectation that we saw was back in the summer. The expectation was for the consensus was about 6.6% on GDP. And so with that, we've started to see those expectations come down, basically south of 6%. And so we are seeing the impact of the variant and some of the different economic issues that are going on there. In addition to that, we're seeing the supply chain issues also cut into economic growth, in the sense that we don't have as much automobile capacity, for an example, because of chips and things like that. In addition to that, we're also seeing some inflationary elements. And so, and these are typically, when we're looking across the economy, they're continuing to ebb and flow. At first, it was lumber. Now it's paint. And so it's these different types of things. So we're likely to see that continue moving forward, but we do expect economic growth to continue beyond that. We also recently got through the debt ceiling debate. So there was something that was passed last night. And so that has essentially been taken off the table at this point. In addition to that, we're looking at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve continues to remain vigilant as far as providing ample liquidity and also ample monetary capacity for the economy. And so rates are still at the 0 to 0.25 level, but they are going to taper their purchases. They're purchasing approximately $80 billion of US Treasuries, $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities for a total of $120 billion. Well, chances are we're going to see that taper take place either in November or December. And that taper will likely to get down to zero purchases, will likely take, let's just call it around 7 or 8 months is what the expectation is today. The yield curve has steepened on some of that news. And so we are seeing rates moving higher. This is as of June 30, this report, but we have seen more recently where rates have started to tick up here. We now have the 10-year note up to about 1.5% and the 5-year note around 1% when we look at that. As we move forward from here, this is looking at the unemployment. So on the left-hand side, you can see that's non-farm payroll. So we continue to grow jobs there. The green line is the headline. The dashed line there is the 3-month moving average. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that that's the unemployment rate. So the dashed line there is what we call the underemployment rate. And then the green line there is the unemployment rate. You can see that those are still trending lower. So we continue to see the employment picture continue to improve. We have had some weaker numbers more recently, but we're definitely thinking that the chances are we're going to see employment pick up as we get through the remainder of the year. Then looking at gross domestic product. So on the left-hand side, you can see that those are the components of gross domestic product. Here we're showing the last 4 quarters, with the last quarter being the June 2021 quarter. And basically it tells the recovery from the pandemic. So if you look at the very bottom number there, the total, you can see that the September number was the recovery. And then the subsequent numbers there have been additions to that economic growth. I really think the graph on the right-hand side shows that a little bit better. And so when you look at the quarter-over-quarter changes, that's in the green bars there. And then what you can see in that maroon line there is the year-over-year change. So you can see on a year-over-year basis, a very positive number there for GDP, and GDP continues to grow, continues to recover. Then looking at bond yields. So on the left-hand side there, you can see those are the bond yields looking over the last 10 years. The dotted line there is for the 2-year Treasury note. The dashed line is the 5-year Treasury note. And then you have the green line there being the 10-year Treasury note. If you look at this, what you can see more recently, the 2-year Treasury note has actually started to pick up as we've started to see maybe the Fed removing some of its monetary accommodation. The 5-year note has started to pick up. We did see a pretty steep decline in the 10-year note if you look at over the last 6 months, but now we're starting to retrace that as the Fed is starting to potentially taper probably in the next couple of months its bond purchases that we spoke about before. And then looking at the right-hand side, this is looking at the yield curve for US Treasuries. The bottom axis there is the terms, the left-hand axis is the yields. And so from August of 2020 is the dotted line. You can see May 2021 is the dashed line. And then the green line there is from August of 2021. So we definitely have seen longer term rates come down. This is looking at the periodic table of returns. I'm not going to go through every line here. I'm just going to show you that this is really different types of returns for different asset classes, and it goes year by year. So you can see it starts off with stocks and goes all the way down to commodities. Just focus in on 2020 and also year to date. You can see that we've had spectacular equity returns in 2020, and then also year to date, we've also seen commodities come back up, and also real estate is coming back once again. And so bonds fit right now in that kind of negative category. That's because we have some rising interest rates, but definitely they provided some buffer to those portfolios that had those over that period of time. And as we look at page 10, just looking at the objectives. So of course it's safety, liquidity, and yield is this portfolio. It only includes fixed income securities, and really it's about getting a rate of return that's equal to or greater than the benchmark over a market cycle. I would consider a market cycle to be 3 to 5 years. And then we only purchase securities that are consistent with your investment policy and California government code. For this particular portfolio, remember it has a maximum maturity of 5 years. And then in addition to that, it is all fixed income, i.e. bonds that are in this portfolio. Here you can see the compliance. That's on page 11. We have a compliance system that looks at trades that are put into your system on both a pre-trade and also post-trade comparison. And so we look at our Bloomberg system and essentially those trades are monitored on an ongoing basis to ensure compliance in the portfolio. And so on page 11 and also 12, you can see that your portfolio fully complies with the investment policy. And then looking on page 13, I'm just going to look at this table moving left to right, and I'm going to focus in on 630. Your portfolio's average maturity is 2.05. The duration of your portfolio is 1.83. The purchase yield is 1.23. If you think about one of those alternatives that's out there for you, that's a very short-term alternative, thinking about LAIF. LAIF is yielding today around 20 basis points. So definitely by having these longer-term securities, it's benefiting the overall earnings of the portfolio. Then the market yield is 31 basis points. It's a AA plus rated portfolio, and the portfolio is $374.2 million. You can see on page 14, looking at a comparison from June 30 from March 31st. I'm going to focus in on June 30 as far as the different sectors that are owned in the portfolio. And so you can see the largest percentage there are US Treasuries and also agency securities, making up a little bit more than 60% of the portfolio. Then we also own supranational securities. We also own negotiable CDs. The money market fund is a very small percentage. Remember, that's the lowest yielding investment, so we tend to minimize that. Then we have corporate securities that are 16%. CMOs or collateralized mortgage obligations are 5.5%. And then on the very top there, you can see ABS or asset-backed securities are 9.1% of the portfolio. Here you can see the different issuers on page 15. You can see the issuer name from left to right, the security type, and also the percentage. And you can see there the US government is the top security. Then you can see its agencies. And then below that, you can see the different corporate securities. Notice in the corporate securities, its percentages are 2% or less. So it's a very well diversified portfolio. And then you can also see that on page 16. You can see the investment performance on page 17. And so you can see in the graph above, your portfolio over the last 12 months is in the green. The gray is that of the benchmark. And so you can see that over the last 12 months here, the portfolio has done a little bit better than that of the benchmark. And then if you look at your since inception number, also exceeded that. When we look at LAIF on the very bottom, I mentioned LAIF before as being one of those comparables. Over the last 3 months, we basically have equaled that of LAIF. Over the last 12 months, underperforming a little bit, but remember your portfolio has a higher yield. And so over the long term, it will eventually continue to beat LAIF. And what you can see on that very last column there, the since inception, is that your return is 2.21% versus that of LAIF, which was 1.07%. So over 1 percentage point higher than that of LAIF, and also about 7 basis points over that of the benchmark.
Hey, Jason, can I jump in, just make 2 brief comments real quick on this?
Sure.
So first of all, I do think it's important to recognize the subtleties of these numbers here. 2.21 versus 1.07. You may be aware that throughout the state and really the country, many agencies tend to rely upon others to invest their money. And in California, the Local Agency Investment Fund, or LAIF, is the most commonly used investment pool for all kinds of agencies throughout the state. And this is run by very well by the state of California, but the returns are really kind of low, and it's such a large portfolio. I say it's kind of like a barge on the ocean. It doesn't turn or move very quickly. So when you see the difference between LAIF and what we're earning, that's really the benefit of doing our own management and having it managed by others, by Chandler, and then the OPEB portfolio is similarly managed by PFM. One other point I just want to make is it's also more helpful to be looking at the percentages instead of the overall portfolio size, because we do every year have needs, and that portfolio balance can change based upon draws. And so we have been drawing down on our reserves by board direction over the past few years. In lieu of doing higher rate increases, we've been spending down reserves. So that has impacted this portfolio. I don't have a number offhand to report to you, but that's why I think it's more helpful to look at these percentage earnings numbers. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
All right, great. Thanks, Jeff. And then looking forward from here you can see some of the transaction activity. And so you can see some of the purchases and the sales. Really, purchases have been made in treasuries, corporates, and also asset-backed securities. And then, of course, we're always consulting the staff about the liquidity needs of the portfolio. So if there are any that are needed, we ensure that there is adequate liquidity in the portfolio to satisfy those. And with that, that concludes my presentation, and I can take any questions that you may have.
So I just have two questions. Thank you for the presentation. And I don't know where I saw this, but it was in one of the attachments that were provided to us, showing that we are investing in real estate investment trusts.
So that would be actually the piece that's managed by PFM, and so that is where that's appropriate in this particular portfolio. This investment policy and California Government Code prohibits that.
Yeah, because that was where I was headed with this. I didn't understand when I saw that in the list of issues that we were participating in, how we could do that. So that was one question. Then my other question is, are the proceeds, the returns that we get, are those reinvested, or are those funds that are given back to us by checks, or is it just automatically reinvested back into those same funds?
So it is automatically reinvested into the securities and things like that that are permitted by the investment policy, unless the district directs us where they want to potentially withdraw some funds out of the portfolio.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Jason?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
We'll pivot over to Ellen Clark from PFM, who will discuss the OPEB portfolio. I'm sure she's chomping at the bit to answer Director Aguilar's question on REITs.
So Director Aguilar, we do have REITs in this portfolio. So good morning. Excuse me, I'm happy to be here. And I'm going to just give you a very brief update on the OPEB trust that PFM manages for the district. As you know, and as Jason shared, the economy continues to change. Excuse me, I haven't been talking, so. And we adjust the portfolio to try to take advantage of different opportunities, investment opportunities in the markets. and also manage the risk of the portfolio. So what you see here is you see the S&P 500 trend line beginning at the January 1st of 2021 through really the end of August. What we show here are 4 dots on the plane where we've made some decisions or adjustments to the current OPEB portfolio. So we did add, Director Aguilar, we did add real estate investment trusts to the portfolio in March of 2021, March 8th, 2021. That allocation was taken primarily from the domestic equity segment of the portfolio. And the reason that we did that is because we are not getting yield on the fixed income side of the portfolio. And one of the characteristics of real estate investment trusts is that they have to pay out all of their income as dividend. Then you see there on May 10th, we actually added a dedicated allocation to commodities, and we took that allocation from fixed income. So we are significantly underweight fixed income in the OPEB portfolio, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And we further diversified the fixed income and added a preferred securities element to the portfolio on August 11th. And then on September 14th, we added a small allocation to convertible bonds. All of these transactions are to increase the yield of the portfolio, take advantage of some price anomalies on some of these sub-asset classes, and reduce the risk of the portfolio. In addition to these 4 moves, we did make an adjustment at the end of September to de-risk the portfolio even a little bit further by adjusting and taking out some monies out of commodities or out of stocks and put it into commodities and convertible bonds. So increasing our weight there just a little bit. As of September 21st, the markets were still up quite handsomely. They gave a little bit away in the last week, but the third quarter of 2021 is the worst one we've had in a while, and the month of September was the worst month that we've had since 2011. So the S&P 500 did eke out a bit of a positive return, but we're sitting on a year-to-date return for the S&P 500, something in the neighborhood of 15%. So let's just look at where you have the portfolio structured. And this is information as of August 31st. So about $36 million in the portfolio. The graphic below shows that as of the 31st of August, we were a little bit overweight domestic equity. We were on target with our international equity. Other growth is that allocation to real estate investment trusts. We're significantly underweight income or fixed income, traditional fixed income. And that underweight to traditional fixed income is funding those other areas, the other growth, the other income, which is preferred securities, real return, which is the commodities. Also in other growth is where we have the convertible bonds. On a performance basis, on a year-to-date basis through the end of August, the portfolio was up 11%. Through the, I would expect that that's a little bit less after September, not much. So 11% year-to-date versus the blended benchmark, they're at 9.4%. And then since inception, this is a 5-year number. We started managing the money just a little bit over 5 years and 1 month. So 11.2% over the last 5+ years versus the market at 10.4%. So we have been able to provide you with significant additional return in the OPEB portfolio, and we continue to modify the portfolio within the parameters of the investment policy to manage the risk and maintain as much return as we can. And that concludes my comments. If there are any other questions from the directors.
Well, Ellen, I think maybe you want to just clarify for Director Aguilar's benefit, specifically answer the how are we able to invest in REITs for OPEB, and just, briefly comment on how the rules are different for this kind of portfolio versus
Sure.
our regular portfolio.
Sure.
Did I capture that good, Director Aguilar?
Yeah, no, Jeff, thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that question. You said it better than I.
So Director Aguilar, these monies to pay the OPEB liability that the district has are set aside in what we call a Section 115 trust. And they're set aside in that trust, and once they go into the trust, they can be only used for one purpose. And that purpose is to pay your OPEB, your long-term OPEB liability, other post-employment benefits. And when you put the money into a trust like that, that allows you to have a much broader range of investment choices than you're allowed under California Government Code 53601, which is the portfolio that Chandler is managing for you. So in this portfolio, we have the ability to invest in stocks and bonds, longer term bonds, lower credit quality bonds, REITs, convertible bonds, traded commodity funds, things of that sort.
I got it. Thank
And
you much. I appreciate the clarification on that.
so, we have a few more tools in our toolbox than you do in the traditional short-term fixed income California code portfolio.
Got it. Understood.
I would just say that both companies are doing a great job managing their portfolios under the rules that limit what they can invest in.
Got it. Thank you.
We'll take this moment to come as a follow-up. So the item that we had on there that we're not going to be discussing does relate to the investment policies, plural. There's one for each of the portfolios. And I like paper. I printed out the documents. And so it was about half an inch thick just on that item. And we didn't have time to put together a good summary. We're not required to implement changes to policy each year. It's highly recommended by GFOA and CDAC, the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission, that agencies do a annual review of their investment policies. They kind of stop right there, suggest an annual review, which can mean, the finance director does it on his own, say, yeah, we don't need to do anything. But the changes which both Chandler for the large portfolio and PFM for the OPEB portfolio are largely nominal changes, just tweaks. We like to stay as much in conformance with state laws and regulations, and just the general advice that's coming from like CDAC on where agencies should be and not be. So that half an inch document has a lot of pages to cover, basically pretty modest tweaks. So we'll bring that back hopefully at the next meeting, and I promise you we'll have a summary document that we'll focus on, that will highlight, so you don't have to go digging for stuff. And I apologize you had to even concern yourself about that this time. Are there any additional questions from the board?
Not from me.
Okay, then I think we're done. Vice President Estrada, and
Yeah, I don't have no questions.
okay, and we'll be working with Sylvia to schedule another meeting probably in around February. Nothing's out there that where we have to do something by a certain time, but we'll be planning that next meeting.
Okay, perfect. And if there's
Okay.
no further questions, I'm not hearing, we're gonna adjourn at 11:49.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.